and welcome to Between Parks Place and Capitol Hill, the Six News show all about law and government in Australia. I'm your host, Stuart Jeffrey, GovCheck editor and the host of this program.
And I'm Leo Puglisi. And today we are speaking with Kobe Shetty, the member for Balmain in the New South Wales Parliament, Greens MP and the party's anti-corruption spokesperson, to discuss that recent ICAC report about former Premier Gladys Berejiklian and her secret boyfriend and former MP for Wagga Wagga, Darryl Maguire. They've both been found to have engaged in seriously corrupt conduct. This is a report that's taken quite a while to come out. There's been a lot of reaction from the major parties and right across social media to what is a significant report about a pretty significant person. No criminal charges, though, recommended against Gladys Berejiklian, which made this really interesting. So we spoke to Kobe Shetty a short time ago.
They haven't shed a lot of light, to be honest, on why this time has been taken for the findings to come out. I think it really just indicates that there's a lack of resourcing within the ICAC, and really we should be looking at having enough funding so that these matters can be investigated quickly and the findings can be delivered a bit more promptly, because we do appreciate that it's been a difficult situation, I think, for everyone involved to wait this long to find out exactly what the ICAC was going to come out with.
It's been interesting because both Labor and the Liberals have kind of had the same kind of messaging over the past few days, which is talking about how this doesn't take away from Gladys Berejiklian's handling of COVID-19 and her previous leadership. Labor obviously notably coming out with the same kind of statements. Chris Minns says that as well. What do you make of all that? That after, she was found to have seriously corrupt conduct, engaged in seriously corrupt conduct, that there's still, from the two major parties, this widespread praise?
I think it's an interesting take on something that's very serious, and this is the second Premier that we've seen now who's gone because of the ICAC and because it's so robust. Look, from my perspective, we don't want politicians in Parliament who are undertaking corrupt behaviour. And I don't think that it's really relevant that she was a very popular Premier. I think she did a good job while she was here, but the fact is that the public expects more from politicians. They are absolutely sick and tired of corruption in New South Wales politics. We have unfortunately seen it from both Labor and the Liberal Party over the last couple of decades. And I do think that it's an interesting approach to be lavishing the praise on about her time as Premier when the ICAC has come out and found that she had undertaken serious corrupt conduct. So from my perspective, the ICAC is working, and that's exactly what it's there for. And we want to make sure that it is really robust and that it continues to catch out politicians who are engaging in corrupt behaviour.
Chris Minns, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he effectively said that being under investigation by ICAC, that should not mean an automatic resignation, an automatic end to an individual's political career. Do you agree with that? That, being investigated, not necessarily findings against someone yet, that shouldn't point blank mean they have to go from Parliament, even those who are in a higher ranking position, like obviously Premier?
Yeah, I mean, I probably agree with that statement. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach to corruption, and particularly when we don't have the findings, it's not going to be the case, I think, that every person who's being investigated by the ICAC should resign. But what we knew here, and I think the fact is that Berejiklian was aware of what was coming out, and I think it was quite clear from the kind of evidence that we were hearing from those hearings and from what she was aware was about to be put into the public sphere, that her reputation was severely compromised and that it was appropriate as a Premier, when she was under such severe scrutiny with the kind of information that was being released, that it was probably appropriate for her to resign under those circumstances.
And I think one thing I have seen a lot of is complaints about, say, the procedural fairness about the trial, or rather the investigation. I remember Maggie Wang, who was heavily involved in the visa scheme side of things, complained, and the commissioner noted that she complained about it being potentially unfair. And of course, the commissioner reminded her that the way this operates is it's not a court. It's the commission there is to investigate and to do its own fact finding, and of course that's not something that really happens in the court. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on that as a model for proving corruption, rather than going to, say, a trial, which I know some have seen saying would be the better route to go here.
Look, I think it's the thing that make the ICAC as powerful as it is are the same things that mean that they can't then be criminally prosecuted. The ICAC is able to compel witnesses to turn up and to give evidence, and that is completely different to a criminal investigation. And I think that that is the thing that gives the ICAC power. We wouldn't want to take away any of the robustness that allows the ICAC to get witnesses to come and testify and to give evidence about their corrupt undertakings, or to talk about the things that are being investigated. So it's very important that the ICAC remains as strong as it does. But unfortunately, because they're compelling witnesses to speak against their wishes, anything that comes out in those hearings are not able to be used in a criminal prosecution. So the bar is obviously a lot higher for criminal prosecution, and I think that that's right. That's the way that it should be, because there are different standards that are there. But in terms of what ICAC does, the reason that it is so robust, and the reason that we've seen 2 premiers and almost a dozen other politicians go because of findings of the ICAC, is because it's so robust and because it can compel people to speak. So I understand that it's incredibly frustrating for the general public to hear that these politicians are undertaking this corrupt behaviour and there's no criminal follow-up. But I think without the ICAC operating the way that it does, we would still have a lot of corrupt politicians in New South Wales politics making decisions about where public money is being spent. And I would have some very big concerns about those people operating in New South Wales Parliament and spending public funds when they're undertaking this sort of behaviour. So, it's a tricky one, but I think that it's really important that the ICAC can actually investigate the way that it does and compel people to give evidence on these hearings.
Now, of course, we're talking here about the potential legal battle afterwards as well. And when it comes to moving forward from the commission to an actual criminal trial. And we've got to remember that this wasn't just about Gladys Berejiklian. In fact, it began with looking just at Daryl Maguire. And of course, the commissioner has recommended criminal charges against Maguire, but not against Gladys Berejiklian. And of course, the commissioner has that power to choose whether or not to recommend to the DPP to lay criminal charges after this. But generally, we don't see that discretion really being exercised. It's pretty straightforward usually. But of course, now here we've got recommended for criminal charges against Maguire, but not against Berejiklian. And I wanted to get your thoughts on whether that should be changed, whether the commissioner should be recommending charges laid against Gladys Berejiklian as a result of the findings of this commission, because of course the commissioner did find that she engaged in grossly corrupt conduct here.
Yeah, I can appreciate where the commissioner is coming from, and what they've said is that the amount of evidence that they've got outside of what she said in those ICAC hearings, which are inadmissible in criminal court, is not enough for them to believe that they're able to actually criminally prosecute her. And I can appreciate that that is probably the case, and I think that that's a reasonable position to have. In the case of Daryl Maguire, I think it's quite clear that he was doing some very dodgy stuff, and really the finding of serious corrupt conduct against Berejiklian only relates to the fact that she didn't report her suspicions about his corruption to the ICAC. So the ICAC isn't actually saying that she behaved in any way herself as a part of these dealings. She wasn't profiting from them. She wasn't involved in any of these corrupt dealings that Maguire was involved in to try and enrich himself personally. But the fact that she was aware of what he was up to is what has found her in hot water in terms of the serious corrupt conduct allegation. So in terms of trying to prosecute that in a criminal court, there's just not enough evidence for that to stand up, and I can appreciate why they've come to that position. I think we've seen a lot of information around what Maguire was up to, and I can certainly see the difference when we're talking about what they've found Berejiklian to have done compared to the sort of things that he was doing to try and line his pockets. It seems like a much more straightforward thing to take him to criminal court and see if he can be prosecuted for the things that he was up to. I think it's really frustrating for the public that they keep seeing these corrupt politicians, and there's feeling that there's no consequences for these people and they can continue to just be involved in corrupt conduct, and they'll get a slap on the wrist or have a bit of their public reputation is tarnished, but they are still able to sort of operate in the world and carry on with their lives as if they haven't done anything. I can appreciate that's really frustrating, but the reality is that criminal prosecution is the bar is just much, much higher. And what we've found the ICAC to be really good for is to be able to investigate to a higher level to what criminal investigations can, because they have those powers to compel people to speak. And it's through those public hearings and being able to compel politicians to actually give evidence that we have been able to make sure that they're not politicians anymore. And so it may seem like it's an unfair outcome 2 years later that Berejiklian is still working her corporate job at Optus, and she's not ending up with any further criminal consequences. But the reality is that she was the Premier of New South Wales, and because of the ICAC and the work they were doing, she's no longer the Premier. She's not been able to spend those last couple of years making decisions about how public money is being spent. And when someone's in a relationship that they have failed to disclose that is compromising their ability to make sound judgments about the way that public money is being spent, I think the result of her not being the Premier is still a positive one, even though we haven't seen her have any criminal charges pressed. So understandably frustrating, I think, for people, but we don't want these kind of politicians in politics anymore making decisions.
And just on the timeline, because it did take quite some time, I think everyone agrees, whether they are on the side of Gladys Berejiklian or not, that it just took so long. Would you like to see some kind of always set time frame for ICAC from a start to a finish of an investigation, or do you think it should be on an investigation by investigation basis, given how significant one involving a former Premier would be compared to a random MP?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the ICAC has said is that the reason that this investigation has taken so long is because of the amount of evidence that they've had to go through. I would argue that it's still longer than anyone would have liked to see. So there's certainly a place, I think, to have some kind of mechanism to make sure that these findings are delivered as quickly as possible. I don't know that an arbitrary number would be suitable, but I certainly think that we should be looking into how the ICAC can deliver findings more quickly. And I do really think that a lot of it comes down to resourcing. We had the Perrottet government last year decline to fund ICAC independently. So the government is still in charge of how much funding they receive and could potentially reduce the amount of funding that the ICAC's getting. And I think we know that there's thousands and thousands of cases that are referred to the ICAC every year, and only a handful of those cases are investigated. So there's certainly an argument here, I think, given the amount of time that was spent delivering these findings, that was taken to deliver these findings. There's certainly an argument here that the ICAC could do with some more resourcing, and that we should be looking at how we can fund it better so that they have what they need to be able to deliver these findings more quickly.
And of course, earlier this year, there was a ruling effect. I believe I wrote an article on it at the point in time that came out. The Freedom of Information Commissioner at the federal level also lacked resources. You had 3-4 year waits for freedom of information requests, and of course the court said, well, we can't do anything. We can't compel the commissioner to make certain priorities because that's not our area. And of course, it's a question of getting more resources. So would you like to see an overhaul of the system, potentially whether that includes cooperation between the federal and state level governments to overhaul the entire system? Of course, Labor has brought in the NACC this year, also looking at overhauling the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. So would you like to see some more cooperation between the various governments on overhauling a system federally to make it more uniform in how they deal with these corruption issues?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how the NACC pans out and what that looks like and how they proceed and how much they're able to investigate. But I think we can see from the amount of corruption and, as you say, the wait times on freedom of information documentation is extreme. And sometimes they're the only way that we can start to actually unpack some of the issues around corruption and things that are going on behind the scenes that are, not what we would like to be seeing in terms of decision making. So certainly more funding to try and improve those systems. And I think over time we'll see how the NACC's going, and definitely some collaboration between state and federal governments to make sure that things are going smoothly and quickly, and that things that need investigating can be investigated in a timely manner. Because we don't want corrupt politicians sitting there for another 2 or 3 years while these kind of anti-corruption bodies are struggling to keep up with the demand for their work. So it's really important that corruption commissions and these different bodies are funded really well so that they can be effective.
And that was Kobe Shetty. As I mentioned there, Leo, of course, we are seeing the NACC being brought in federally this year by the new Labor federal government. Of course, we asked Kobe Shetty about this, but I wanted to get your thoughts on it as well, as to whether or not you think that we could see a broader Australia-wide reform being brought on by the Berejiklian report, by the Freedom of Information Commissioner issues, and also by the reforms for the AAT and the NACC.
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me now that it's obviously in every state now federal, and we know federal-state cooperation. It's happened in a lot of things over the past few years, COVID namely being the big thing, but getting all the corruption commissioners and commissions working together on key things would be pretty significant. But it's interesting because the NACC, it's already had a bunch of referrals, and I guess I know referrals basically just refers to anyone, bringing up something. It's nothing too significant necessarily. But even before it came into effect, which was over the weekend on July 1, we already had the Coalition and the Greens announcing their priorities. The Coalition looking at things like the payment to Brittany Higgins, the Greens looking at things like Scott Morrison's multiple ministries. The government, though, this was something really interesting. The federal Labor government apparently isn't going to be really making referrals. They want to stress how independent the NACC is, and they want to assure Australians it's independent. So it seems like most of the referrals are going to be coming from the Coalition, and almost all the referrals are going to be coming from the Coalition and the crossbench. And there's quite a lot of things they could go at. Again, the Greens also talking about things like the PwC scandal, which is continuing to develop. So it seems like this is going to be a really big tool, I guess, that the non-government parties can use or threaten with in terms of action. We'll have to wait and see, because, as I said, people can pretty much just refer any old thing.
Exactly. I find the Greens referral of secret ministries very interesting, given that we've already had an investigation. Of course, the Solicitor General has looked into it, and of course, Virginia Bell, former High Court judge, has also looked into this and said that although his actions were, they weren't illegal, but they also weren't exactly above board. But I don't think we would see the NACC finding anything with regard to corruption there, at least for most of the secret ministry stuff. Of course, him actually making decisions as a minister, which he did on at least one occasion, would possibly be reviewable. But generally, I don't personally see that working. And I also find the Brittany Higgins referral there very interesting. It seems, at least to me, that we could see the NACC, as you said, becoming a bit more of a political body rather than the ICAC in New South Wales or the other state and territorial level.
And of course,
bodies.
remembering, the Coalition were the ones who promised a federal ICAC. We can actually stop using that term now. It is NACC, NACC. No one really calls it the NACC, which is unfortunate. IBAC, but it's not the NACC. But the Coalition, obviously, they talked up an NACC for quite some time, and obviously it didn't eventually happen. And so this was a key political campaign issue during the last election, wasn't it? We had the Teal Independents campaigning on it heavily, the Greens campaigning on it, Labor campaigning on it. I mean, there was even a party called Federal ICAC Now, just devoted to this single issue, which I guess shows, well, I mean, there are single issue parties for just about everything these days, but it does show there was an appetite for it during the campaign, and now it's coming into effect. And it's interesting because The stress, and I just mentioned before, the government really wants to stress how independent it is. They really want to stay out of it. And it's interesting that they might not be making referrals of their own, which is something given we already hear about. Like in New South Wales, as we've just been discussing, if you know of corruption, usually the best thing to do is report it. But if the government's steering clear of referrals, it's going to be interesting to see, these referrals going to be, I'd say, going to be dominated by the coalition and the crossbench, especially the Greens.
And of course, that is consistent with the government's message with the AAT as well. Of course, they overhauled that completely because, again, their issue was that a lot of Liberals were appointed to the AAT, not because they were qualified to look at administrative appeals or anything of that matter, but because they were involved in the Liberal Party. That, of course, was a major concern that the government mentioned at the end of last year, and they have since worked at bringing reforms into the AAT, even considering fully abolishing it and recreating it as something new. Of course, that took on the back burner due to the NACC. But of course, we do also have that area to look to as well within the next 6 months to a year as they bring in those reforms there. And we see the new AAT coming into effect as a new body. Of course, there is really some work being done on it, but I don't think we're going to see the end of the reforms anytime soon. As I mentioned earlier, of course, we could even see at the national cabinet sort of organization of different governments working at reforms, because it is definitely a countrywide issue now. As you mentioned, of course, there, Leo, we've had a political party being formed around this issue itself, single issue party there, looking at getting a federal ICAC or IBAC, what's now the NACC. And there's definitely something I think we could see moving forward, even potentially at the next election, because I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who don't think the government's done enough on this issue.
And that party, by the way, it has disbanded. It disbanded a couple months ago, inevitably, because there was no point to the party anymore. It was interesting, just going on what we discussed earlier. Here's an article from the ABC. I think the terminology they use is the best. Less a referral, it's a complaint. They're making complaints. 44 complaints made to the NACC since it opened its doors on Saturday. Commissioner Paul Brereton says he may hold public hearings, but will also call out people who seek to weaponize the NACC, which I guess goes back to what we were talking about with it becoming a political tool. We talked about the coalition with the Brittany Higgins payment and the like. Paul Brereton said he wanted it to have the reputation of being fearless but fair, independent, and impartial. And the other thing was the NACC is aiming to complete 90% of its inquiries within a year. Do you think that's enough time, given how serious some of these may be, or the serious ones might be that 10% who aren't completed within a 12-month time frame, taking into account you can take off a few weeks for holidays and Christmas and public holidays, and you can rule that out. So give or take 300 days a year, it's operational. Is that enough time to get in 90% of referrals, given there's already been 44 in just a few days?
Well, I think some of those will be pretty easy to dismiss. I'm not going to speculate there, but I believe there are definitely some of the issues that we have seen referred there will be pretty summarily dismissed by Paul Brereton. Of course, he has also started on the New South Wales Court of Appeal, so he has a lot of experience working as a judge. And of course, judges are expected to manage their court's own timetables, so he's got plenty of experience when it comes to case management there. So he's definitely qualified in that department. The issue is going to be resourcing. As we mentioned earlier, of course, there's a lack of resources at the state level, potentially in New South Wales, where it took 2 years to get this investigation completed and published. And of course, I did a Commonwealth Knowledge on this actually earlier this year, talking about the Freedom of Information Commissioner, where he also had delays of years there. So there's definitely going to be a resourcing question, and it's definitely possible, but that would require a lot of resources, and whether the government's going to commit to that at this point in time remains to be seen.
And just quickly, Stuart Robert, who of course is the now former minister and former MP for the seat of Fadden. We've got that by-election on July 15 on the Gold Coast. it was claimed over the past week. Again, quoting the ABC here, the ex-husband of a former owner of a Canberra lobbying firm has used parliamentary privilege to claim the firm planned to funnel money to Robert. Those claims coming from Anthony Data. He was an employee at Synergy 360. So that's already one semi-big name that could be involved here. He is a former minister. And of course, the thing that the NACC has said here is that they will and they have the power to investigate matters from before July 1, before they were formally created. So that can lead to a bit of a backlog, which is why things like Scott Morrison's secret ministries, the Brittany Higgins payment, are being referred.
Of course, well, there's also the issue here, of course, of parliamentary privilege, which is said it's an old English tradition, which is now, of course, built into Australian into the Australian Constitution, and also since then into legislation, which respects the supremacy of Parliament within its own building and its ability to set its own procedures. In fact, it's hard to bring defamation cases against things said within Parliament House for that exact reason, parliamentary privilege. And given that these are referrals or complaints about Scott Morrison and Stuart Robert, both of whom were MPs, it's definitely going to be interesting seeing how much range the NACC has with regards to those MPs, given that they were both in Parliament at the time, although as we have seen in New South Wales, there's definitely the possibility of investigations there. However, these, especially with regards to Scott Morrison, within the halls of Parliament itself, so it's definitely going to be interesting seeing how they try and balance that issue against the need for transparency and to deal with corruption quickly and efficiently.
You'd be forgiven for forgetting, but he's still there on the backbench, Scott Morrison. And look, we might have a by-election. He might simply not run at the next election. But he is there right now in regards to anything that happens to him. So he's still in Parliament for now, at least. But look, we'll wrap it up there again for those who missed anything that Kobe Shetty, Greens MP in New South Wales, said. Go back, watch this on demand. And I'm sure on Commonwealth Knowledge, you'll also be covering this NACC very heavily, because it's going to be really interesting to see what they are, what's both being referred to them and what they're actually going to look into. Because as you said, they can probably, and fair enough, dismiss a lot of the complaints already being made.
Exactly. This weekend's Commonwealth Knowledge, we're looking at the history of ICAC, IPAC, and all those other bodies and why we have them in the first place, looking at a bit of administrative law, going a bit into the AAT, and of course this weekend will also be the 1-year anniversary of Commonwealth Knowledge, so definitely make sure you check that one out when it comes out on Saturday this coming weekend.
All right, thanks everyone for joining us.